my name is Vanessa. I'm going to present some work that I've been doing with colleagues from the Stockholm Resilience Centre, Laura Bethia Campbell, there we go, and Dr. Simon West. Here we go. What I'm going to do today is just give you a bit of a background on the issue here, which is really about gender dynamics in conservation and the narratives of place that are informing our conservation practices. I'm going to then get into a little bit of concepts and theory, and then present to you a pilot study that Laura Bethia did, and then come back with some next steps of our broader project and what we're going to do with that. So, in many places in the Global South, biodiversity conservation is really an alpha male dominated and settler colonial activity. And this is evident in the kind of fortress conservation and green militarization types of interventions that we see all over the world. So this is really, you know, guns, fences, and obviously I don't have to tell you in this room that there is a global movement to diversify and decolonize and transform conservation. And there's a global movement really that, what I mean to say is that gender diversity and inclusion is really seen as critical for a holistic and fair ecosystem stewardship. There have been a lot of gender mainstreaming programs recently that have increased the number and the prominence of women in conservation. But there's little empirical research on the lived experiences of these changes. And what is it that motivates the practices of conservationists who are involved in this shifting landscape? So the project that we have gotten some funding for very recently, that we're just starting out, is called Silverbacks, Black Mambas and Deadly Women. I'm very proud of that, that title. And we're going to be looking at these issues in both the kind of greater Kruger area in South Africa, as well as in top end in Australia. And the aim of the project is really to trace the production of gendered conservation identities in the media and explore how men, women, and non-binary individuals are contesting and transforming these identities in their daily practices. Okay, so now I'm going to I know that it's very difficult on a Thursday afternoon to hit you with some theory, but I just have to do it very quickly. And I'll tell you that I was at first an ecologist in a previous life, and have now ventured more into the social sciences. And so I understand that this is terrifying, but please bear with me because I think you'll find it useful. So we have kind of three pillars of our research project. The first is relational approaches to socio-ecological systems, stewardship, and place meanings. And here we're really relying on this concept that I love, which is sense of place. And we see sense of place as a source of care, which can articulate how our actions to steward the environment can emerge. And there's a lot of sense of place theory out there, and it's kind of a big mess, to be honest. But the concept that we're really focusing on here is that of place meanings. So what does this place mean to people, and how does it underpin our behavior? The second pillar of our concepts here is about performative gender identities, EEC. And what we're talking about here is about gender identities that are, yes, they are related to biological sex, but they are also socially constructed, and they're performed across different contexts and through time. And it was Butler who really helped us to understand and to shift the framing of a gender from men are equated with masculinity and women are equated with femininity, to a different kind of understanding where we can see that there are multiple femininities and masculinities in all of us. Okay. The other kind of approach that we're using is one of intersectionality, where we acknowledge that our gender identities are very much linked to our class and race identities, as well as many other factors. And then the third pillar of our conceptual framework here is about critical social sciences on conservation practice. And I think many of us in the room here are more comfortable with social research for conservation. But this is a little bit more social research on conservation. And we're hoping that uncovering a little bit more of the experiences and perspectives of conservation professionals can help us be a little bit more reflexive and potentially contribute to practice. All right, so now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the pilot study that Laura Bethia did for her master's thesis, and she interviewed and worked with women who work in conservation in the Lowveld, and how place meanings inform their practices, as well as how do these women navigate traditionally male-dominated conservation spaces. Okay, so what she did here was she built a pool of participants that collectively engage in a broad range of conservation practices across these various stakeholder groups, from academics to national reserves, private reserves, landscape level organizations, etc. And she used qualitative in-depth interviews on Zoom. Unfortunately, this was all done during the pandemic, so it was on Zoom. But then what she did, which I thought was quite innovative, was she used photo elicitation to really try and build a bridge across the computer screen, you know? And so the women who participated in this study, they collected photographs that they had already and used those to really explain their lived experience of these landscapes and of being a woman in these landscapes. So what did she find? She found that place meanings serve as motivators to practice conservation in the Lowveld. So there was really this real reverence for this landscape. You know, the Lowveld and the greater Kruger area was seen as this mecca of conservation and the epicenter of biodiversity. And the meanings were associated with a sense of belonging, a sense of awe, and they kind of reveal these notions of care that underlie participants' motivations. You can see here, Karen said, here it is like conservation is such an important part of our national identity. Kruger as a place is a being. The land itself is so full of character. Some participants also emphasize the deep emotional attachments associated with kinship ties and the desire to kind of practice reciprocity in their home communities, as Lesedi reports. I just want to say that all of these photos are taken by the participants, but we've anonymized the names. So she says, you're serving your community, you're serving your people, because it's where I come from, it's my people, it's my landscape. So notions of care are also emerging from kind of negative place experiences. And this is a little bit what Verve was talking about on the first day, that there's this very strong negative perception of high game fences among our participants, that they feel that these fences represent unequal socio-ecological legacies of apartheid, and the fragmentation of landscapes. And so for them, this is really a motivation to prioritize efforts to restore community relations and beyond the fence protected area expansion. So to the next question then, how do women conservationists navigate these conservation spaces? And unanimously, our participants found that the Lowveld conservation landscape was very heavily male-driven. A lot of our participants told us about how they are experiencing informal discrimination, including assumed incapability, assumed lack of knowledge, cultural expectations to make sacrifices for their family, harassment, intimidation, racial discrimination. So this is showing us that there is still quite some hegemonic masculinity and militarized practices that are shaping the social norms and the expectations of gender roles. Now, this picture on the left here is showing how, sorry, Isak's going to show me, okay. So this picture on the left here is showing how participants themselves categorized normative masculinities as authoritativeness, aggression, toughness, callousness, performances of military bravado. And on the other side, they categorize normative femininities as subservience, caregiving, empathy, performances of multifaceted and bridging roles. And so what do they do with this? Our participants told us that when facing challenges of such a masculine space, participants describe having to develop coping strategies to be able to prove their worth and claim space, and to be in order to be taken seriously in their conservation arenas. So they are kind of negotiating between these normative femininities and normative masculinities. And Laura Bethia found there were sort of three main negotiations happening here between proving physical toughness and demonstrating emotional responsiveness, between developing public assertiveness and working quietly behind the scenes. And of course, these are highly personalized negotiations that are happening for each individual person. But what it shows us is that there's this tension that performing shifting gender identities might expand the participation of women in conservation, but it can also reinforce some of these gender binaries and the dominance of masculinities. Critically, all the participants really value and see a need for beyond the fence approaches, fostering communication and performing bridging roles. But they feel that the militaristic conservation reality in this space, especially with its normative expectations of gender roles, is a bit of a barrier to implementing more inclusive practices. So what they do then is, for many women, they feel they have to embody some of these characteristics that are traditionally coded as masculine. And so I've included a photo here of the black mambas that one of the participants she's included. Another way that women cope with these challenges in this landscape is that they rely on place meanings and practices as restorative resources for personal well-being. And kind of a renewing of professional motivation. So Karen says here, it's so important to reconnect you to the why. It reconnects you to the reason you're there, and why you're doing what you're doing. So what does this mean for kind of landscape level stewardship? Well, the first thing it means is that notions of care are not neutral, and they are negotiated in particular political contexts. Another thing that it means is that women here, we can see, are playing quite a significant role in the landscape and in changing gender identities and practices, and particularly in engaging beyond the fence. So these practices are contributing to the interruption of some quite entrenched militarized approaches, and some of those approaches, which I think we all in this room can agree can be unsustainable in the long run. And then what I want to say as well is that equality, of course, equality and conservation here is not only about getting more women into the room and into these leadership positions and into conservation, but also we need to question the practices that reinforce these gender binaries, and we can see that from Laura Bethia's research. So what are the next steps for our broader project? As we've, you can see there's a lot more to get into here. And our participants feel that gender in conservation can't only be studied as a women's issue. So we will definitely expand the participant base and include men and non-binary participants. How are gender identities in conservation constructed in the media? So I was very interested in Isak's presentation as well here, looking at the media. And what we will do is a critical discourse analysis to try to understand, how are men and women in conservation being portrayed, particularly in the national media. And then we're going to do some more photo voice exercises to understand how are individual identities performed by conservationists, and how do these identities inform their practices. And right at the end, we'll do a conceptual synthesis and try to understand, are there maybe some seeds here for kind of more widespread transformations? So as you can see, we're quite at the beginning of this project, so I'm very interested to hear all of your thoughts and ideas on the project. So please get in touch with me, and thank you very much for listening.